Along with some colleagues, I'm involved in a patient adverse event reporting website called risk.org. And I really do want you to pay heed to this and go into it and use it and tell any of the people you know who are on any pills of any sort and anything strange and unusual happening to them on pills to go and report it. But the talk you're going to hear might sound like it's a sales pitch for risk.org. It's not. The talk you're going to hear came first, and risk.org came as an answer to the issues you're going to hear about. You need to hear about it up front, though, because you may have your doubts about all this and may want to ask me about it at the end. What we're looking at is something like this. I believe there's a crisis in medicine that's comparable to the crisis facing the Catholic Church 10 or 12 years ago on the issues of child abuse. Here's the Pope with the cardinals from the United States. They're convened to try and sort out a problem that's begun to emerge. People have talked about being abused by priests and bishops or whatever, and the church is trying to work out how it's going to respond. The credibility of the church is on the line, and medicine and healthcare generally, what I'm going to put to you today, is in a very comparable position to what the church was in then. Our credibility is on the line, and we need to sort things out just the way, you know, the Catholic Church got their issues sorted out extremely well. Well, we need to see if we can do as well. Now, in the case of the church, probably very few of you here come from that kind of worldview, that we can put things right by going into a box and confess our sins and take a wafer and get involved in rituals. But in fact, any of you who are evidence-based medicine adherents these days are likely to be doing exactly the same thing. The wafer is controlled trials, and you've got rituals about publishing data and things like that that you think are going to sort problems out in almost the same magical way that the church feels that the sacraments do. The issues we're facing today are issues that are caught here in this particular slide. The woman on the right, when she sees things happening on a plane that she's flying, trouble, problems, a near miss, when she reports them, everybody pays heed to her. The woman on the left, when she sees things going wrong and she reports them, a near miss, whatever, no one pays heed to her. Her observations are regarded as anecdotes. Your observations about the effects of pills will be regarded as anecdotal. They'll be put in a box and disregarded. And what we've got to try and do is try and restore our ability, your ability, to believe the evidence of your own eyes. I'm going to try and persuade you that you're operating in a world these days, whether you're the clinician or the patient, where you're being told you cannot believe the evidence of your own eyes. And that's what we've got to try and solve. Now, there's a lot of people who are adherents of evidence-based medicine, and I'm one of them. I mean, I believe in controlled trials, that they can be useful. I believe in an evidence-based medicine approach towards trying to get hold of all of the data and try and work out from having all of the data what treatments really do. That's all a good thing to be doing. But those people who really believe, who are the true believers, think the only thing that's wrong with evidence-based medicine is its corruption by the pharmaceutical industry. The fact that industry don't publish all of the clinical trials that they do, the fact that they ghostwrite trials, the fact that they miscode the data in trials, the fact that they use statistics to obscure problems. We're going to go through all of these issues. The message here is, if only industry didn't have their muddy hands on the pure sacrament of controlled trials, everything would be okay. We'd be able to sort things out. And the answer, I mean, or what I'm going to be putting to you is, no, everything wouldn't be okay, because controlled trials don't do this. They're not sacramental in this sense. Let's begin with the ghostwriting issues. And again, this is only going to be awfully brief. It's just to try, I mean, there'll be a bunch of you here in the room who are committed to evidence-based medicine and will feel that the only issues are the corruption from industry. I want to take your concerns on board and make sure you realize that I fully know what all these issues are, but that after that, there are even bigger problems. Let's take a controlled trial, one of the most famous controlled trials there is at this stage. This is study 329, which is a study of paroxetine, which is one of the SSRIs in children who are depressed. And this appears in the journal with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry. It appears with an authorship line to die for. The names on this authorship line are the people who are the biggest names in the field. The average doctor over in the United States seeing these names saying that this drug is safe and effective to give to children who are depressed will think, I must race out there and put every kid I can see who's remotely depressed and anxious on this drug. I mean, the article appears in the Bible and it's authored by the saints. Okay? In fact, however, the true author is not there on the authorship line. This is a ghost-written study. 3 years beforehand, GlaxoSmithKline, that produced the drug, have concluded that our drug does not work. In this trial, did not work for children who are depressed. What are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to pick the good bits of the data out and we're going to publish those, and that's what you see here. A scandal. But just in case you think this is a rare thing, I've been able to pick out some rare scandal. I want to persuade you otherwise. We're going to be dealing mainly in this talk with the antidepressants, but everything I say applies to any other drug that you or your parents or your family or your friends may be on, whether they're respiratory drugs or gut drugs or any other kind of drugs, painkillers for arthritis, whatever. The same thing applies to the lot. FDA get to see the clinical trials that are done that bring drugs on the market. And here's the group of antidepressants that are on the market at the moment, the ones most widely used. And here are the clinical trials that were done to bring these drugs to the market. Up on the upper half of the line, you see the white boxes, which are published trials saying, in each case, that this drug works extremely well and is effective. They're positive publications for the drug. There's 3 black boxes that you see there. They're negative publications for the drug. Based on the data you see here, we've got groups like the Cochrane reviewers. There's the NICE guidelines. There's a range of other groups who are in the business of trying to sift the evidence for all the rest of us, getting hold of all the trials that have been published and trying to work out, well, which of the antidepressants is the one we should use, or which arthritic drugs should we use, or asthma drugs should we use. In the case of the antidepressants, the Cochrane reviewers, as you see here in an article that appeared in The Lancet, based on the kind of data you've seen there, concluded that we should be using sertraline. Let me just go back a slide. Sertraline is the 3rd drug on the right there. You see boxes 61 and 62. There's only 2 positive publications, but the Cochrane reviewers have looked at the strength of the publications and concluded that if you're a doctor and thinking about using one of these drugs, what you should be using is the 1/3 from the right, sertraline, and that's the article that you see here. FDA, however, get to see more than the published articles. They get to see other trials have been done that aren't necessarily published. And if you look at the full cohort of trials that FDA got to see, the picture looks like this. You now see that half the trials were done on these drugs were negative trials for the drug. There's a number of new trials there that you hadn't seen before, but there's also a number of old trials there that were white boxes before but are now black boxes. 1/3 of the positive publications that you saw on the previous slide, in fact, FDA had concluded were negative studies for the drug. If you're going to pick out the worst antidepressant to use, well, the worst one is obviously the 3rd drug from the right, sertraline, Zoloft, where only 20% of the trials are positive, 80% are negative. One of the positive trials you saw before, in fact, was a negative trial. So if you think there are bodies out there like the NICE guidelines or the Cochrane reviewers or any other people you care to think about who have no links to the pharmaceutical industry, who are disinterestedly looking at the evidence and can come up with the right answer, you're mistaken. The way the system works, industry control it completely, and the Cochrane reviewers and the NICE guidelines have become a marketing tool for the pharmaceutical industry. The best kind of marketing tool because they're not paid by industry. And this returns us to this slide here. As of 2004, a fuss blew up about children becoming depressed on the antidepressants. In terms of the published literature at that point in time of trials done with antidepressants in the case of children who were depressed, 100% of these trials were ghost-written. In terms of the published literature completely said that these drugs work effectively and are safe, and we now know that in every single case where that was said, that was wrong. There is a complete mismatch between what the published literature says on the one side and what the data, when we get access to it, says on the other side. This is the greatest known divide in all of medicine, but is not unique to antidepressants and is not unique to children. It applies to every other drug that you may be taking. So that's dealt with the first 2 points there. We're going to rattle through these trivial and superficial issues first before we get on to the deeper issues. Miscoding and mislocation of the data. Where the previous slide said miscoding. Let me quickly tell you about miscoding. If any of you go on an antidepressant and become suicidal, there's a good chance that you may be described or coded as treatment non-responsive. You may drop out of the trial and you'll be coded as a dropout. You won't be coded as becoming suicidal. You may be coded as having become more depressed. You may be coded as having nausea. If you had nausea and agitation and were also suicidal, well, if the first thing you had was nausea, chances are you'll be coded as nauseated rather than anything else. But mislocation of the data is one of the other things that happens, so I'm just going to touch on these things briefly before moving on. There's the distribution of the suicidal acts that happened in the clinical trials of these 3 drugs. One of the tricky periods is what's called the washout period there at the top, when if you go into a trial before the trial proper starts, you're taken off drugs you were on before you then get randomized to either the active drug or the placebo. Now, this is a tricky period, as we know now, the period where you're washed out from previous drugs. You're quite likely to go on to a suicidal act. But of course, it's a period when you're on nothing. And being on nothing is the same as being on placebo, isn't it? Well, certainly what the pharmaceutical industry would like you to believe and what they were prepared to say to the regulators and others, because the published literature on the distribution of the suicidal acts in these trials, in fact, looks like that. That's what's published. I've explained to you what happened to the balls up there at the top. Look down at the bottom where you see there's the point at which the control trial proper stops. And then you've got a red ball which is moved up above the line. Let me explain to you what happened in the case of one of those red balls. These were paroxetine trials. And after the trial was over, a person on placebo in the trial, in the 30-day period after the randomized phase is over, the doctor has the option then to put them on active treatment. And in this man's case, he was put on Prozac, and he went on 10 days later to commit suicide, and he's classified as a paroxetine placebo suicide. I mean, paroxetine trial, suicide that happened on placebo, not on the SSRI. That's what ghostwriting and mislocation gets you. The use of statistics to obscure. Well, this is nothing to do with ghostwriting and non-publication. This is where we enter into a realm that's more problematic again. And the realm is this, that evidence, the believing the evidence of your own eyes. We don't believe the evidence of doctors or patients' eyes because they're biased. Doctors bring bias to treatment. We need to control this bias with controlled trials. That's why you recruit hundreds of patients and have a range of different doctors to have a look at what's actually happening to the patient on treatment. Now, if the treatment does no good at all, what the observations will look like is this. I mean, when I say no good, I mean if it has no particular effect for good or bad, right? This is what the observations will look like. There'll be a bunch of doctors or a bunch of patients who think actually the treatments work quite well, and their observations lie over to the left of the 1.0 line, and a bunch of doctors who think that the treatment didn't work all that well, and their observations will lie over to the right. But broadly speaking, if you look at the distribution, the peak of the curve will lie over 1.0. If the treatment works well, the curve shifts left. If the treatment works poorly, the curve shifts right. Now, when the first anecdotal reports came in about Prozac causing people to commit suicide, you had observations by doctors putting patients on Prozac who became suicidal. After the drug was stopped, the problem cleared up. You put the patient back on the drug, the problem reappears. It was very convincing evidence the drug was making people suicidal. The response from the companies and the regulators and the GMC and the FBI and the SAS and the DOH and everyone else you care to think of was, these are anecdotes. Let's have a look at what the science says. So this article appeared in the BMJ saying, well, actually the science shows there's no problem. When you take all of the controlled trials which are going to handle the issue of the bias of doctors and patients, this is what the controlled trials look like. A bit hard to make out what that's showing to you. Let me show you what it actually boils down to. It's this. That's what the curve looks like. There's a shift to the right. There's a doubling of the rate of suicidal acts on Prozac compared to placebo in these trials. Okay, the company go on to draw a conclusion that everyone here in this room should agree with, and the BMJ who published the article agreed with, and 100,000 people who read the BMJ who have no links to the pharmaceutical industry, don't work in the mental health field, and have no particular reason to think that the company has this wrong. They all can agree with this particular statement, and did agree with it, which is that analyzing the incidence of the suicidal acts on Prozac in this case shows no statistically significant increased risk on Prozac compared to placebo. Everybody can agree with that. But you shouldn't agree with the next statement the company makes. It runs straight on from this to the next statement, which nobody who reads the BMJ, 100,000 people read the BMJ, most have no links to the pharmaceutical industry, but nobody objected to this statement, which is data from these trials do not show an increase in risk. Now, I would put it to you that you take an 8-year-old or 12-year-old and ask them, is there an increase in risk on Prozac here? They would say to you, yes, there is. This scientific data is totally consistent with the observations of patients and doctors reporting that Prozac is making them suicidal. But actually the scientific evidence has been used to discredit the observation of your own eyes. You're being told you may think it's that way, that's what you seem to see, but that's not what's happening. The fact that there's a chance that the data didn't arise by virtue of the drug, that they could have arisen by chance, is you're being asked to reinterpret that to mean that there was no increase. Let me show you what's going on. You'll know that during the 1960s, the tobacco industry ran a campaign that has later been called the Doubt Is Our Product campaign. And this showed the effort was to say to people who started to think that maybe smoking causes lung cancer and heart attacks, to show graphs of increasing life expectancy during the 20th century. From the start of the century to the end of the 1960s, people were living longer and smoking more. And the tobacco industry said to people, look, this couldn't be happening if what those guys out there are saying is true, that our drug causes you to get lung cancer and heart attacks. They were trying to sow doubt in your mind. Well, what you're seeing here is the most sophisticated version of the doubt is our product strategy that we've ever had, which is, there's the data for the SSRIs and what it looks like. There's a twofold increase in risk of people going on to a completed suicide or a suicidal act on these drugs. The data is statistically significant. Now, let's say we introduce the next generation of drugs, the TTSJ, and TTSJ just means S plus 1 and R plus 1 and I plus 1. I mean, there's no such group of drugs as the TTSJs, okay? But let's say we have the next group of drugs. And let's say the data looks like this, that there's an 8-fold increase in risk in people going on to a completed suicide or a suicidal act on these drugs. But the data is not statistically significant. What the pharmaceutical industry are saying to you, and what the MHRA in this country are saying to you, and FDA in the United States, and the DOH, and the BMJ, and everybody else that you care to think of, that the safe drug, the drug, if you have to take one of these two drugs, the safe drug for you to take is a TTSJ, the SSRIs are the dangerous drugs. In fact, TTSJs are 4 times riskier than SSRIs. Do not take the TTSJ if you have an option. Doctors, however, are being trained to regard the SSRIs as the only risky drug here. They will fail their exams if they say TTSJs have any risk at all linked to them. If there's a chance that the TTSJ observations have arisen by chance, and there is a terribly small chance that they did, that chance is being interpreted as evidence that there is no risk. This comes back to the point that I've been trying to make to you. The evidence of your own eyes has been discredited in front of your own eyes. Right. This doesn't just apply to the group of drugs that you've seen here. In the case of most of the major drug disasters in recent years, exactly the same thing is applied. You've all heard of the painkiller Vioxx. In the major trial of it, it was compared to another painkiller called naproxen. There were 4,300 patients in the Vioxx arm of the trial, 4,300 patients in the naproxen arm of the trial. There were 3 heart attacks on Vioxx that were removed from the mix by the company. And this sounds horrific to most people. But what should be more horrific is the fact that the company published an article in JAMA, which is also read by 100,000 people, showing 17 heart attacks in the 4,300 patients taking Vioxx versus 4 heart attacks in the 4,300 patients taking naproxen, and said there is no increased risk in heart attacks on Vioxx compared to naproxen. Not a single person wrote into JAMA and said, that's wrong. Look, it's obvious that there's an increase in risk. If they'd left the 3 missing heart attacks in there, the data would have been statistically significant, so you see why 3 heart attacks had to be removed. But they're hiding much more heart attacks in broad light of day. It's there in the paper, and people can't see that this increase in risk is an increase in risk. Now, one of the big issues in recent weeks, and it's literally just last week this issue came to a head, was the issue of access to the data. When industry run trials, they hide the data. No one has access to the data afterwards, and a lot of people have been saying for a long time we can solve most of these problems if we just have access to the data. That led the BMJ to run this campaign 2 or 3 weeks ago, saying that, look, the key thing here is we've got to insist on access to the data from the trials the pharmaceutical industry run. There was a meeting last week in the European Medicines Agency because EMA have offered to make the data from these clinical trials publicly available, and the pharmaceutical industry has fought back. There was an offer that was all over the BMJ about 2 or 3 weeks ago by GlaxoSmithKline saying, of course we believe in transparency. We will make the data available to selected scientists rather than to the public at large, or mavericks who come from places like North Wales. We'll make the data available for people to look at. If the GlaxoSmithKline proposal, which is not just a GlaxoSmithKline proposal, but it's an industry-wide proposal, is the one that wins out, we will be in a worse position than we are at the moment with the current lack of access that we. It's not just in that domain. It's in a world where here's Clint Eastwood, as you can see, talking to the patient who isn't in the chair. And that's the world doctors are increasingly in. We do not see the patient anymore. The guidelines tell us what we do, regardless of what the patient in the chair might show. They may as well be invisible. Now, you might think it's a laughing matter, but really it's not for most doctors or anyone who works in healthcare these days, because in my continuing professional development form 2 years ago, I put this down here at the bottom: to avoid being sacked for non-compliance with guidelines, that is, to avoid being sacked for delivering good medical care. Every doctor, anyone working in healthcare, increasingly is in a world these days where if you don't conform to the guidelines, you are at increasing risk of being sacked. If you work in Johns Hopkins University at the moment, if you do not take your mandatory flu vaccination by December the 1st, in a few days' time, you will be sacked, period. So, the woman on the right reports to an adverse event reporting system, the ASRS. The woman on the left reports to the AERS, the adverse event reporting system for doctors. The woman on the right is believed, the woman on the left is not. She's discredited. Her observations are worthless. We've got to reproduce a situation in which the observations of both patients and the women on the right are believed. Of course, part of the reason the woman on the right's observations aren't believed, part of the reason she doesn't kick up a fuss, of course, is compared to the woman on the right who's on the plane that you're on, and if the plane goes down and you die, she does too. The woman on the left is not on the plane she puts you on. She's piloting you from the ground, and if you go down, well, that's tough luck. She's still fine. So what happens now? The sacraments, evidence-based medicine in particular, has failed us. There's two answers to the problem, I think. There's you can take a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. You can take a shower or a bidet approach towards the issue. I think the answer has to be a bidet approach. And that's what led to the creation of risk.org, where we want people to go in and report on adverse events that are happening to them on drugs. What we're going to do is, unlike anyone else, well, A, for a start, the FDA have 3.5 million or more reports on adverse events that happen on any of the drugs you conceivably could be on. There's a number of companies in the business over in the States of trying to sell you the FDA data. You know, if I go on Prozac, will I turn blue? They'll charge you $200 for a report. We make all this information available to you for free, and it's worth, I mean, even if you aren't on drugs, you might find out some interesting things about drugs by just going into risk.org. What we're going to be doing, though, is if you guys and anyone else you can find goes onto risk.org and reports anything that's happening on drug, and we're not just talking about heart attacks, we are talking about changes in your hair, changes in your skin, all sorts of things, that we're going to, we believe that what the way to answer the problem is to get teamwork going between you and your doctor, but also to feed back to people local knowledge. In the FDA data you can see here, you can see that Seroxat causes liver problems. There have been reports of liver problems to FDA. Most of them are coming from Japan. The people who are going to work out what's going on here are the Japanese. They have a real interest trying to work out exactly what's going on. When you make the knowledge local, you can solve the problems. We're going to feed back things so that people in Cardiff might find out their hair turns blue on Prozac, but it's not happening down in Swansea. We believe that the way to solve these things is to give you the information as to what's going on, and you can bring local knowledge to bear on why it's happening here and not there. Okay, thank you. No, I think the issue is we don't all agree that there are negative effects. The companies just simply do not accept there are negative effects. They do extraordinary things to hide the issues. So it's trying to get an agreement on the full range of effects that a drug has. It's not trying to say they're all bad, don't use them. It's just simply trying to restore a world where people who, I mean, this is what happens. People on a drug called Zyprexa, which is one of the drugs used to stabilize moods, gain 4 or 5 stone in weight. The companies say to you, our controlled trials show no evidence of weight gain. So even in the face of people generally saying he's become Michelin man, your evidence, your ability to believe the evidence of your own eyes is being discredited. We are trying to restore your ability to believe the evidence of your own eyes. There comes a point where you have to believe what the patient's saying. In the same way, controlled trials terribly useful. I mean, do wonderful things in helping show us the biases that we bring to therapy, that clinical psychologists bring to therapy, doctors bring to therapy, anybody involved in healthcare brings to therapy, and the patient brings too. But if we ever get to the point of not being able to believe the evidence of our own eyes, we're in the comparable position the Catholic Church we're in, which is, you know, not accepting the evidence when it gets to a point that it's overwhelming. And that's what we've got to. We have simply, I mean, the patient has become invisible in front of us. I'm pleased to hear that you don't go by the guidelines. I'm slightly concerned for you, which is, I think there's a growing risk you're going to lose your job if you're systematically not going by the guidelines. So the point is, it's not anti-quantification. I am a great believer in controlled trials, but I'm an even more passionate believer in the idea that they shouldn't be the only golf club in the bag.